If you are looking for more ASMR content from me, I do have my original ASMR channel before I created this one, and that is always linked down in the description box below. And as always, my notes and my scripts are on the side of the screen, which is why I will be looking over there quite a bit throughout the video. Tonight's case is unlike any case that I've covered on here, but also is such a strange case period in all the years that I've been researching true crime. I've never heard anything quite like this. But without further ado, let's just get right on into it. So, born in 1999, Sydney Powell was in her early 20s at the time of this tragic incident. She attended Mountain Union University in Ohio and was known to be a fairly private individual. Described as intelligent but facing academic difficulties, Sydney had a close yet sometimes strained relationship with her parents, particularly over her performance in school. Her personality was often seen as quiet and introverted, with few public indications of trouble until the events leading to her mother's death. Brenda Powell, Sydney's mother, was born on February 16th, 1970, and she worked as a child life specialist at Akron Children's Hospital, a job that reflected her nurturing, compassionate, and empathetic personality. Brenda was described as warm-hearted and dedicated to both her family and her profession, where she helped children cope with illnesses. As a mother, Brenda was known to be supportive and involved in Sydney's life, especially in relation to her academics, though this aspect of the relationship appeared to add some tension. By 2020, Sydney was in her early 20s, a young adult navigating the pressures of higher education and personal expectations. Like I said, she was enrolled at Mount Union University in Alliance, Ohio, where she had been pursuing her degree for several years. However, Sydney was not excelling academically. She struggled to maintain the grades required to continue her education, and as a result, her standing at the university was precarious. Academic performance had always been a significant aspect in Sydney's life. Like many young people, she may have felt the weight of familial and societal expectations to succeed, and when things did not go as planned, these pressures began to mount. Her academic struggles intensified in the months leading up to the murder, and she was facing potential expulsion from Mount Union University due to poor academic performance. The thought of being expelled from school weighed heavily on Sydney. For a student in her early 20s, especially one who had already invested years into this degree, this would have felt like a life-altering crisis. Such academic setbacks can affect a person's sense of worth, future prospects, and relationships, and for Sydney, this was no exception. While it is unclear exactly when her academic troubles began, by 2020, they had reached a critical point where her future at the university was at serious risk. Now, a little bit more on Brenda, the mother, the victim of this crime. Brenda Powell was 50 years old at the time of her death. She was a devoted mother and a respected professional. And again, her work involved supporting children and their families through medical crises, and she was known to be compassionate. Her colleagues described her as someone who dedicated her life to helping others, especially those in vulnerable situations. succeed. This dynamic could have contributed to some tension between the two, especially as Sydney's academic situation became more dire. Brenda's relationship with Sydney was, by most accounts, typical of a mother and daughter, though it is likely that Sydney's struggle created stress within the family. While Brenda did her best to support Sydney, the looming threat of expulsion placed a strain on their interactions, particularly as Sydney grappled with feelings of failure and shame. Brenda's attempts to help Sydney may have been perceived as added on pressure, adding to her daughter's mounting emotional turmoil. So now we're going to begin on the day that this occurred. In the morning, we're going to start and go throughout the entire day. So the morning of March 3rd, 2020 began like any other day for the Powell family. Brenda Powell, who worked again as the child life specialist, had her usual routines, balancing her professional duties with her role as a mother. Sydney Powell, on the other hand, was grappling with her own issues. It is entirely possible, if not likely, that Sydney had not fully communicated the severity of her academic situation to her mother prior to that day. However, the situation had escalated beyond Sydney's control, and the university had contacted her parents regarding her academic performance, forcing the issue to the forefront. By midday, Brenda had become actively involved in addressing Sydney's academic troubles. That is because sometime in the afternoon, Brenda received a call from officials at Mount Union University to discuss her daughter's academic standing. This phone call was a pivotal moment, and it appears to have triggered a chain of emotional reactions in Sydney. Brenda, in her role as a concerned mother, was likely trying to fully understand the full scope of Sydney's academic situation and what could have been done to prevent expulsion from the school. For Sydney, this was a moment of extreme emotional distress. The thought of her mother directly speaking with university officials about her academics may have felt like an invasion of privacy, a confirmation of her worst fears, and a threat to her future all rolled into one. While Brenda was on this phone call, Sydney was present in the home, and it is believed that she overheard parts of this conversation. The specifics of the conversation between Brenda and the university officials have not been publicly released, but it is reasonable to assume that they discussed Sydney's performance, the possibility of expulsion, and potential next steps. This conversation would have confirmed Sydney's worst fears, that her future was in jeopardy, and that her mother was now fully aware of it. At some point during Brenda's call with the university, a confrontation occurred between Sydney and her mother. The precise details of how the argument began are not fully clear, but it is known that the situation escalated from a verbal confrontation to physical violence. In the context of their conversation, it is likely that Brenda was attempting to help or console Sydney. She may have been trying to discuss what steps could be taken to salvage Sydney's career, or she may have been expressing her disappointment while also trying to find a solution. This much is, again, unclear, as it has not been proven exactly what was said. For Sydney, however, the situation may have felt inescapable. Her mother's well-intentioned involvement may have only intensified Sydney's feelings of shame and failure. It's possible that Sydney misinterpreted her mother's words as judgment or pressure, exacerbating her emotional distress. This misunderstanding, combined with Sydney's psychological state, and I'm about to go a little bit more into it, will become apparent later on. I'm not just like saying this for no reason. It is important to understand like the scope of the case. So, in moments of extreme emotional distress, people can sometimes act in ways that are out of character, driven by fear, panic, and or an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Sydney, who had never exhibited violent tendencies before, may have reached a psychological breaking point where she was unable to regulate her emotions or control her actions. The stress of the moment, combined with months of underlying anxiety and the immediate danger of the phone call, likely led to a temporary loss of control. Experts in psychology and mental health often describe such moments as acute stress reactions. During these episodes, a person's brain becomes so overwhelmed by stress hormones, such as cortisol and adrenaline, that their ability to think rationally or clearly is significantly impaired. Sydney, in this moment, was likely operating in a state of fight or flight, a physiological response where the body perceives a threat and prepares to either confront or escape it, and she chose the former. In Sydney's case, her mother's involvement in the situation may have been perceived as a threat to her autonomy and a sense of self. The combination of these factors led Sydney to act violently, resulting in her mother's tragic death. Following this violent confrontation, Brenda was severely injured to the point of death. Emergency services were called to the Powell residence, but by the time they arrived, it was too late to save Brenda's life. Sydney was taken into custody shortly thereafter, and it was clear that she was in a state of emotional and psychological distress. The shock of what had transpired had not fully registered for Sydney, who had acted in a moment of extreme emotional crisis. The primary cause of death, as determined by the medical examiner for Brenda Powell, was blunt force trauma to the head. Brenda was struck multiple times in the head with a heavy object, believed to be a knife sharpener, during the attack. These repeated blows resulted in severe head trauma, which led to extensive bleeding and catastrophic damage to her skull and brain. The nature of the injuries was consistent with a violent and sustained attack, indicating the intensity of the assault. And by sustained, I mean that she had to have struck her mother multiple times in rapid succession with no stopping for this type of outcome. The autopsy revealed that Brenda suffered multiple lacerations, also to her scalp and face. The repeated strikes to her head caused fractures to her skull, which in turn led to a traumatic brain injury. The blunt force impact caused bleeding within the brain, as well as swelling, which would have quickly impaired Brenda's cognitive and motor functions. The number of blows and the force used indicated that the attack was relentless. In addition to the head injuries, Brenda also had defensive wounds on her arms and hands. These wounds suggested that she had attempted to defend herself during the assault, raising her arms to shield her head and face from the blows. Defensive wounds are common in cases of violent attacks, and they are a clear indication that Brenda was conscious and aware of the assault during the beginning. The presence of these injuries underscores the terror and desperation she likely experienced as she tried to protect herself from her own daughter. theories around the fact that Sydney had assaulted Brenda with a knife sharpener, causing fatal blunt force trauma to the head. Additionally, she was charged with tampering with evidence, as she had reportedly tried to clean up the crime scene before law enforcement arrived. A key aspect of the trial centered on Sydney's mental state at the time of the murder. This is when we're going to tie in all of the information that I gave you prior about her psychological state. Given the sudden and violent nature of the crime, her defense team focused on whether Sydney was suffering from a mental health disorder or emotional breakdown that rendered her incapable of understanding her actions. Sydney's defense argued that she had been experiencing severe emotional distress and was not in her right mind when she attacked her mother. They pointed to her academic struggles at Mount Union University, where she was facing expulsion, and the subsequent confrontation with her mother over this issue as key triggers for the attack. These factors, combined with evidence suggesting Sydney was in an emotionally unstable state, formed the basis of the defense argument for diminished capacity and/or insanity defense. The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation to assess whether Sydney was mentally competent to stand trial and/or whether she could be held criminally responsible for her actions. The evaluation included extensive interviews with mental health professionals, a review of her personal history, and an assessment of her mental state at the time of the crime. The results of the psychiatric evaluation determined that Sydney was competent to stand trial, meaning she was able to understand the proceedings and assist in her own defense. However, questions remained about her mental state at the time of the murder, which would play a significant role in the trial itself. The prosecution painted a picture of Sydney as a young woman who, overwhelmed by fear of academic failure and pressure, reacted violently in a moment of rage. They argued that the murder was intentional and that Sydney knew she was doing when she attacked her mother. The prosecution pointed to the brutality of the assault, noting that Brenda Powell had been struck multiple times with the aforementioned knife sharpener, and the presence of the defensive wounds that indicated that Brenda had tried to fend off the attack. The prosecution also argued that Sydney's actions after the crime, attempting to clean up the scene, demonstrated that she was aware of the gravity of her actions. They presented this as evidence that Sydney was not acting in a state of temporary insanity or emotional breakdown, but instead intentionally tried to cover up the crime after it occurred. The defense argued that Sydney had been under immense stress due to her failing academic performance in the confrontation with her mother on the day of the murder. They contended that Sydney had suffered a mental breakdown and was not in control of her actions during this attack. The defense suggested that Sydney's fear of disappointing her mother, combined with the anxiety surrounding her possible expulsion, led her to snap in a moment of emotional crisis. The defense relied heavily on the testimony of mental that while Sydney may have been under emotional distress, she was ultimately responsible for her own actions. The jury's decision was based on the evidence presented by the prosecution, including the brutality of the attack, the presence of defensive wounds, and Sydney's attempt to clean up the crime scene. They concluded that the murder had been intentional and that Sydney was aware of her actions at the time. Following the guilty verdict, Sydney Powell was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the murder of her mother, Brenda Powell. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime, but it also allowed for the possibility of parole after 15 years, given Sydney's young age and the emotional and psychological factors at play. During sentencing, Sydney expressed remorse for her actions, though her statements were brief. The courtroom was filled with emotion as family members and friends of both Brenda and Sydney struggled to come to terms with the outcome. So that is the case of Sydney and Brenda Powell. I had not heard of this case when it happened. I actually heard about it on a podcast a couple years ago. This was before the trial. The podcast is Killer Instinct. It's on Apple Music and Spotify. I absolutely love that podcast. If you're into true crime podcasts, I would definitely check it out if you haven't. Killer Instinct by Savannah Primer. That's the first time I heard about this case, and when she covered it, the trial had not happened, and of course, no verdict or sentencing. And I remember sitting with it for a while, and I couldn't exactly wrap my head around everything that had occurred. I would love to hear all of your opinions on this case in the comments below. It's just so insane to me how recently this happened, and there's just so many shocking things about this case. A detail that I forgot to include in the script is that when Brenda was on the phone with the university and Sydney started attacking her, she actually dropped the phone and the call didn't end. So the person on the other end who was speaking to Brenda actually heard some of the attack happen. But if I remember correctly, it was very muffled and they couldn't really understand what was happening. And Sydney did hang up the phone, so she had the thought to hang up the phone after. Another interesting thing about this case is that Sydney exhibited absolutely no violent behavior before this. Absolutely none. Of course, you hear about the homicidal triad, wetting the bed, setting fires, and harming and or killing animals. None of that was present. There were no reports of her even, bullying people at school or any disciplinary action prior to college, of course. Absolutely zero reports. It's just so strange that she just snapped one day and chose violence when never in her life had she ever done that. And not only did she choose violence, she chose extreme violence. I think that this case would have been easier to swallow. Of course, never easy to swallow or not even acceptable or whatever. I think you get what I'm trying to say. Of course, it's never going to be easy to swallow, but I think it would have been easier to swallow if the attack hadn't been so brutal psychological aspects and explanations and theories and everything, connected to everything. I'm extremely interested in criminal psychology and deviant behavior and everything. And most of the time, I can't logically understand the progression of deviance with most cases and the reasoning behind certain things. Of course, not sympathize or empathize, but I can logically understand. I cannot even logically understand this. The only explanation I could give was maybe if she was in such a diminished capacity state, as the defense argued, that she was so diminished mentally that she genuinely wasn't aware of what was going on at all, like blacked out and just acted violently. But I don't, again, it would make so much more sense if it was just like one hit and that was it. But yeah, I'm like stumbling over my words because this case is so disturbing to me. As a person who has an exceedingly close relationship with my mother, my mom is my best friend. I cannot fathom even like plucking a hair from my mom's head, like, which is, I can't understand it. I just really can't. Again, I usually can, but for this one, I just have a hard time sort of swallowing everything. I do want to say that I do agree with the jury's decision to sentence her, and I also do agree with the possibility of parole, only if a mental illness is detected and treated, and of course if she's deemed not a potential harm to others or herself. Because again, if this truly was a moment of acute psychological distress, you sort of see this with the PTSD sufferers, where they will go into moments of like extreme aggression, unbeknownst to them. If it was a case similar to that, I can understand the desire for parole if that is treated. However, I do think